In this lecture series, we'll be looking at some of the living aspects of the Earth and how they function. The book focuses on a case study of the Biosphere 2 project down in the Arizona desert. And in that, scientists and engineers tried to replicate functioning living Earth systems and do so under controlled environments. The purpose was to study basic ecosystem science, but also with applications to colonization of other planets, climate change adaptation, and for a variety of purposes. But the question comes, to what extent can we control, replicate, and engineer Earth's living systems alongside our efforts to try and manage its physical systems, such as controlling rivers through dams or other physical works. So you should be reading Chapter 6 for this first few sections of the lecture on ecosystems and nutrient cycling. So I would direct you to the book, and again, I'm required that you read the book more closely during this unit to determine what, in detail, Biosphere 2 is and what it represented as an experiment. But for our focuses, it's going to be here more on the general biosphere of the Earth's natural systems. So what is the biosphere? It's the total area on Earth where living things are found. So obviously large places in Antarctica or the Greenland ice sheets don't have much in the way of living systems other than transient animals perhaps, or certain algae and things that may grow on the snow. But for the most part, the Earth system has multiple different ecosystems, and we'll talk about those. So of the different types of ecosystems, we find a variety of categories or like groupings that we'll find repeatedly throughout the Earth. Oceans, as you're familiar with, are the most common because they cover the largest portion of the Earth's surface. Coastlines, or transition between that oceanic surface and the land surface. You'll have tidal systems and tidal pools and such. Inland, you'll find grasslands and shrublands, and this would be common if you were going, say, from the ocean to the coast, inland, say, in Southern California. And of course, there are large-scale and various types of forests, whether they be temperate, coniferous forests, or other tropical systems. You can also find deserts that come in a wide variety of different types, depending on their location and influences and proximity to the coast. You can have freshwater aquatic systems, lakes, ponds, rivers, and flowing waters, especially in streams and upland systems. All of these are different examples or types of natural ecosystems. In contrast, humans have, over their recent past, over the last 10,000 years or so, contributed to two major types of ecosystems that humans manage and heavily influence. One is farmlands, whether they be row crops, or essentially artificial forests through orchards. And then, of course, there are the urban and suburban areas, which have their own characteristic physical and living systems. Within each of these ecosystems, there are several different components or properties. Species are those individual groups of animals that have common attributes, and more importantly, they have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So if two different animals, say for example, were able to mate, but couldn't provide or couldn't produce a fertile offspring, then those would be considered individual distinct species. A population is all members of the given species in a particular area. So you could have a bird population of, say, seagulls living in a certain area that would constitute the same species, perhaps the seagulls further up or down a coastline, but would be, if they stayed in close proximity to a given area, then that would be a local population. A biological community is populations of all species that interact in a particular area. So again, all of the birds, all the plants, all the animals, and so on, living in a particular forested region would be its biological community. And then an ecosystem, a term we've used and now we'll define a little bit more specifically, is the biological community, or the biotic, interacting with its physical environment, or the abiotic. And these terms are used, the abiotic and biotic are used somewhat interchangeably with the other terms of biological and physical. All of these terms, and virtually every one that's noted in red on these lectures, you need to be familiar with and know the definitions of, and be able to give an example of. So if you have a given ecosystem, in this case a forested system up on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, what determines that particular ecosystem is a forest and not a desert or grassland or some other form of biological community? And it's the combination of its physical environment coupled with the location that will determine what sort of biological system develops. So ecosystem formation is a function of the abiotic environment, and typically moisture and temperature. So the amount of rainfall that provides moisture to the land surface and the temperature characteristics will predict what sort of plant regime you get. In this case, if you get a particularly moist climate, then you'll get a forest as opposed to, say, a grassland or a desert. And depending on the temperature, you'll determine what type of forest it is, whether it's a conifer forest or a deciduous forest or so on. And in the plant community, largely predicts the animal community or the animal populations present, and that's determining whether on predators, say for example, you would have a lynx, maybe at a colder climate, or a bobcat in a more temperate situation. So the physical system really sets the basic controls on what sort of biological communities will occur in a given area, and ultimately what ecosystem will be established and persist. So again, the book shows you in a diagrammatic form the biosphere at the largest scale, the global scale, is all of the local, all aspects of the Earth's surface and things that live on it. A biome, which we're going to come back to in a little bit more detail, is a larger regional portion of the biosphere with similar groupings of characteristics and biological communities. Within the biome, you'll have characteristic ecosystems. The ecosystems will be comprised of communities. The communities, again, are all of the populations of plants and animals and so on. And then within the population, you can have individual members of that particular species. So there's a continuum here from the global scale down to the individual that describes where we or any organism fits into the scheme of things. So now we turn to the question of how the biosphere functions. And again, the living portions of the Earth have two very fundamental processes. They engage and support energy flow and also nutrient cycling. And we'll consider each of these. Energy flow is driven by, ultimately, the incoming energy inputs and electromagnetic radiation coming in from the sun. Thus, the Earth, as a global system, is open to energy from space, incoming solar radiation and outgoing losses of terrestrial radiation that leave the Earth and its atmosphere and bleed off into space. But from a material or a matter point of view, the Earth is largely closed. We get the odd meteor or perhaps, in geologic time, an asteroid strike, but the amount of mass and matter added to or subtracted from the Earth is negligible from the standpoint of the total mass of the Earth. So the Earth is open with regard to energy, but closed with regard to matter or materials. And the various elements or nutrients or physical matter components that we have on the Earth cycle in and out of various processes. Communities and ecosystems contain both matter, and in that we distinguish largely the term biomass, which is the weight of all living material, and a trophic level, which we'll define in a moment. And then they also, again, another important thing they do is pass energy through the ecosystem as well. And that's done through this notion of a trophic level. These are feeding levels within a food chain. So going back to early days of your science education, you probably learned about food chains and food webs, where we get our nutrition, where different plants and animals consume one another, and so on. And this gives rise to a food chain. And so matter and energy pass through that process, and we refer to that as different feeding levels or trophic levels. Together, these terms come together in what's called an ecological pyramid. And this is just a schematic and a conceptual way to describe how matter and energy transfer through a given ecosystem. So if we think about it, with plants as producers and then animals primarily as consumers, which of the levels in this pyramid do you think is occupied by green plants? Largely, it's the first. Okay, so energy comes in from the sun, it's converted through photosynthesis within plants, and then the greatest biomass and the greatest amount of total energy present is going to be in the bottom of the pyramid at level 1, and these will be your producers. Herbivores, animals that eat the plants, will be the primary consumers, and there'll be fewer of them biomass-wise and energetically. And then the predators that eat the cows, and so on, up to the third order, and anything 3 and above is considered a third order consumer, and those would be the top of the food chain, and in this case, in the modern era, largely humans, since nothing typically eats us. So if we talked about trophic levels, so in each step of those, there's a transfer. So again, the producers are the plants, and if you remember from calories and food energy representation, for 10,000 kilocalories at the producer level, when the herbivores consume that, what's left, what they contain as a result of their consumption, metabolism, loss of waste energy and such, they would that would be reduced by several orders of magnitude down to 100 kilocalories. And then the second order consumers eat the primary consumers, and then you're down from 100 kilocalories to 10. And then finally, the third order consumers have only 1 kilocalorie from the standpoint of their total energy presence. So there's a passing of energy through the system that ultimately reduces the amount at each stage of the trophic level. So this trophic level, again, reflects the flow of energy through this ecosystem. And then, again, there's a diagram in the book, and these are fairly typical, relating producers, mainly plants, and consumers in the form of food chains and food webs. And these should be reviewed for you from somewhere in your science training, and I'd encourage you to review these. This concludes the first section of our lecture. We'll move on now to part 2. Now we turn our attention to a way of categorizing different types of ecosystems and living systems on the Earth. That's the notion of a biome. This is a distinctive type of ecosystem that's characterized by occurring at a much larger scale, say at if not a continental scale, a near continental large region of the Earth. There may, even in the large area, be sub-components, different ecosystems present within that. For example, you can have an aquatic ecosystem of a running river or stream in the middle of a desert. Think in terms of the Colorado River flowing through the desert biome of the Southwest. So again, a biome will have a distinctive or characteristic set of ecosystems in it. It's going to be determined largely by climate, recall from the last section that we said that the formation of a given ecosystem is governed by the moisture and temperature regime there. So the amount of rainfall and the array of temperatures are largely what define the climate, and ultimately the climate controls the development of biological communities. And then we identify and categorize these ecosystems into biomes based on predominant vegetation and other organisms that are adapted to those largely climatic conditions with influences of soil, topography, and geology. So these are the biomes that we see on the Earth, which are important from the standpoint of thinking of how the whole Earth interacts. So how many and what types of biomes are there on the planet? They can be organized largely into three types. As we noted earlier, you can have terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. And then within each of these larger categories, there are different subgroups depending on mainly the plant communities present. So typically you'll see a diagram of something like this, which shows temperature on the y-axis and the vertical axis, ranging from 0 to cold or above and warmer below. And then on the horizontal or x-axis, you'll be going from drier to the left, typically, and wetter to the right. And so as you might imagine, the tropical rainforest will have the highest temperatures and the highest rainfall, whereas the tundra, the Arctic conditions and Antarctic conditions, or mainly Arctic, will have the coldest temperatures, and you may be surprised to realize that the tundra is largely a desert from the standpoint of getting very little active rainfall. And then the desert systems that you're typically familiar with when you think of the term are typically warmer, although there can be cold deserts such as the Great Basin, and they get very, very, very low rainfall. In between, you'll find varying conditions of grassland, ranges of forest, and the forest type largely changing with the amount of rainfall and the temperatures that occur in that region. And again, you can find that where do you find the tundra? Where do you find the coldest systems? These are largely in the Arctic or high latitude areas, and then the equatorial regions where you'll find the tropical systems. So again, these types of diagrams relating temperature and precipitation as representations of climate are common basis for defining our different biomes that we see. So when we think for a moment on what Biosphere 2 attempted to do, was trying to capture at least a representation of the total biosphere, in that there are multiple biomes and multiple ecosystems present. They established at least three major types of biomes, and the rainforest, an ocean system with some savanna nearby, and then a desert, coupled to human habitat or a human ecosystem, and then agricultural ecosystem as well. So they tried to have multiple aspects, multiple biomes in the natural world present under controlled conditions in order to mimic their interaction. And then it's interesting that because the role of the atmosphere and to try to keep a completely controlled, constrained environment, they actually established a lung structure that allowed variations of air pressure and gas exchange coming out of these various systems. So this was probably one of the most complex engineered structures ever built from the standpoint of trying to create and manage living replicas of very complex systems within the Earth. And what they learned is that as the more complexity you represent in a system, the greater the interactions and the further additional complexity that grows in. So when you compare the natural biosphere with the Biosphere 2 representation, the Earth system, the natural biosphere, is global scale and extremely complex, massively so, with multiple different biomes and transitions among them that all can affect its overall function. Biosphere 2, in contrast, was a very small system. While it had interacting multiple biomes, but it was only about 3 acres in size. And one of the bigger challenges was to create the interface or the connection between them from the standpoint of natural transitions that occur on the Earth over large areas, now had to be constrained to junctions and connections between different elements of the structure. So it's very difficult to downscale a planetary set of biomes into a 3-acre parcel and then connect everything in a way that mimics the real world. But it was a worthy attempt. So when you think about the biomes, they can have similar processes going on in terms of nutrient cycling, energy flow, but they have very different sets of species present. So comparing a desert to a forest, again, both have similar functions in the general sense as processes go, with photosynthesis, energy transfer among trophic levels, and so on. Yet the plant and animal communities present in the desert versus a forest are quite different in their makeup and diversity. And this is mainly because within each biome, the different environmental conditions lead to adaptations from the species present. And it's those adaptations that make them uniquely adapted and allow them to thrive and persist. When you think of temperature, for example, and you have an organism, it's going to have a range of conditions to where the organism thrives and ones where it becomes stresses, whether due to heat or to the cold. The example here with butterflies, or you could do the same with tomato plants or other species you might be fairly familiar with, there's a temperature size, probably a moderate temperature, where that particular factor has the least stress and the most favorable conditions for their ability to function, to fly, seek food, grow, reproduce. But as the temperature gets colder, those metabolic and food-finding processes become more difficult or hotter. And so when you go out of that optimum range in the center of the range of the grants of this chart, you'll find zones of stress. And then when it gets very cold, say freezing conditions, or very hot, high temperature, the butterflies in this example simply cannot survive. So this gives rise to the notion of a range of tolerance. And this is the range of the limiting factor within which the species can survive, thrive, and reproduce. Okay, so the limiting factor is, in this case, the temperature, because temperature obviously places some fundamental constraints on where the butterfly in this example can survive. Now, the limiting factor itself can be then defined as some critical resource or condition whose availability or conditions itself may determine the species, population size, and its distribution. So again, temperature is a very common and hopefully familiar one in terms of where plants or animals can survive. Without the advent of technology, if you had humans as just pure animals, we couldn't survive in the Arctic. We're better at heat adaptation, but there are limits in the higher latitudes to where humans lacking fur or other physiological adaptations cannot survive. We surmount that as technological beings by prehistorically the adoption of furs or other clothing to provide insulation and warmth to enable us to inhabit cold places. And largely, like I say, we're better adapted and more closely equipped to handle warmer climates. And so either where we humans began as a species was closer to tropical systems, and our adaptation of that is, like I say, is more favorable. But it's this notion of limiting factors and the range of tolerance determines which organisms can persist and reproduce in a given location. in relation to the climate, the temperature, and the moisture. Another note about environmental controls, an example from the desert southwest in California. The tolerance limits and the limiting factors can play out differently at different life stages, as you might imagine. The desert pupfish is a very, very unique type of fish that occurs in these small, isolated pools and ponds east of Death Valley. And their ability to tolerate very harsh temperature conditions is different from the juvenile stage versus the adult. Adults can survive from essentially just above freezing, where the liquid water is down around 0 degrees, up to the very hot summer temperatures of 42 degrees C. As you might expect, the juveniles, the youngest fish, have a much more limited range of temperatures that they can tolerate, largely in the intermediate ranges between 20 and 36 degrees C. And so their birth and early development has to occur in those intervening seasons to where the temperatures are moderated to some degree. And you can picture this probably with human babies who can't thermoregulate, say, in their first 6 months and have to be especially cared for. And then as their physiological systems grow and develop, then they're able to thermoregulate and withstand heat and cold much better. So environmental controls and the range of tolerance and the limiting factors play out both at the juvenile stage as far as reproductive success or post-reproductive success, all the way up through the survival and reproduction of the adults. This concludes our second section of the lecture. You should continue now with part 3. In this section, we consider one of the major features or properties of biomes, and that's the extent to which they cause nutrients to cycle through the environment. Ultimately, Biosphere 2 failed to reach its promise of a self-sustaining, complex, managed representation of the natural biosphere. The reasons for its failure were centered on failures within the structure and its system's ability to replicate major nutrient cycles. These nutrient cycles govern the movement of nutrients and virtually all elements, such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on, through both the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. For any given nutrient, it may be present in a biotic reservoir, and that can include things like the producers, the plants, for example, animals, such as various levels of consumers, and then, of course, the decomposers, the things that eat the waste material and the dead and decaying plants and animals in the soil predominantly. So elements can move internally, and nutrients can move internally among those different levels, as we saw when we talked about food webs and the different trophic levels. But they can also pass into abiotic reservoirs, such as the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, or solid rock and soil parts of the earth, and then internally within that, and then likely at some point be returned back to the biological systems of the biotic reservoirs. So there's a very complex but connected relationship between abiotic and biotic systems with regard to how nutrients and elements cycle on the earth. An example from the carbon cycle: with the input of light and radiant energy, plants are able to conduct photosynthesis, wherein they take carbon dioxide and the carbon that's in residence in the atmosphere, which is abiotic, through the biological process of photosynthesis and are stored as biomolecules, and then through cellular respiration, the producers predominantly, and some consumers, or all consumers, will pass that carbon back into the atmosphere into the form of CO2. Energy will pass into use and application of living systems as far as their growth and reproduction and repair and pass through the system and eventually given off as waste heat. But the carbon, just in this simple example, moves from the abiotic environment of the atmosphere through plants and animals and then back to the atmosphere, going from the abiotic to biotic and back to the abiotic atmosphere. So at the larger scale, when you think about an ecosystem or a biome, this plays out globally in ways that we're very dependent on for the maintenance of living systems, but also dealing with the consequences of human intervention, modification, and damage to these processes from the standpoint of changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that's contributing to climate change. This will be the subject of our next lecture. The carbon cycle itself, though, has the respiration, photosynthesis we've talked about, but then it also has internal subcycles through the biological system, through consumption, through decomposition, but then ultimately cycling back to the atmosphere. Just as carbon cycles, so does nitrogen, through different processes, but again, both involving the physical, abiotic, and biotic systems, to where certain types of nitrogen, which can't be used in its native N2 form, can be converted through nitrogen fixation into a plant usable compound and then taken up as a major nutrient to form plants. Plants consumed by animals who contribute waste and either feed other consumers, and the waste is decomposed and cycled back through the soils and then back into the plants. The plants create litter fall, which cycles it internally. And then ultimately, there are some soil processes such as denitrification that cause a certain amount of nitrogen to go back into the atmosphere into N2 form. And those processes are mediated or controlled by microbes in the soil. And then likewise, with soil erosion, both natural and human enhanced, there's going to be a loss of nitrogen from the terrestrial into the ocean, and then that will enter in ultimately into sediments and become of the rock or lithosphere program or system. Phosphorus, likewise, has very similar cycling between the abiotic and the biotic systems. It's also very tied up in soils and transferred from terrestrial to oceanic systems, which ultimately then get bound up into the soil and rock systems. So all of these nutrient cycles are very important from the standpoint of keeping the availability of major nutrients that plant communities and ultimately animals such as humans rely on, but at the same time are constantly being transferred from one biotic reservoir or abiotic reservoir to another. So to look at the Biosphere 2 example, the one interpretation is that the problem is that while plants and animals were normally conducting photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the soil system was not in balance, and it ended up taking out more oxygen than the plants can replace, such that the artificial soils, as they evolved, had to populate with microbes, and those became something of a net sink and ultimately affected both the oxygen cycle and some of the other nutrient cycles as well. So again, it's very difficult to take and manage the highly complex systems of soil, vegetation, and lower atmosphere and control and replicate those from a starting point without having enough time and certainly enough space in order for those systems to function in anything resembling their natural capacity. And as we noted earlier, human activities interfere with a number of the major nutrient cycles that commonly occur in the biosphere and that we rely very heavily on. Examples include deforestation, which reduces the amount of standing plants that can take up carbon from the atmosphere, take up carbon from the atmosphere and store it into long-term biological reservoirs. Burning fossil fuels takes carbon stored in deep geologic environments that are normally not associated with the short turnover atmosphere, and then releasing large quantities of that nitrogen, or carbon and nitrogen, back into the atmosphere. Other cycles that have been interfered with are the through agriculture, both in terms of animal waste and fertilization. And what these do is these rearrange and transport phosphorus and nitrogen such that they are no longer limiting in some cases, but if they're used in excess, then they may be transferred to waterways and create artificial algal blooms and dead zones. So what are our lessons? The main ones are that the ecosystems that comprise the biosphere are very complicated and very difficult to replicate, manage, and control, and that the biosphere itself, because of that complexity and the difficulty of controlling it, is largely irreplaceable. The one thing one could argue that for the large amounts of money that were invested in Biosphere 2 that was wasted. However, I think it can also be argued that the lessons we learned in building and operating and ultimately seeing why Biosphere 2 failed taught scientists a lot about how important processes in the soils and their connection with the standing vegetation and such function, and can help us examine damaged areas and lead to their more effective restoration. And the lessons that Biosphere 2 failed to be a situation where we could readily engineer and control Earth systems involving living communities was, I think, should be a lesson that we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge the value of and rely more on natural systems and not so much on technological optimism that ultimately we can fix problems by replicating living systems and manage